Some fortunes are measured in dollars, but the rarest inheritance is the courage to trust the one person everyone else overlooked. The grand ballroom of the Moretti estate had never felt colder than it did that gray November afternoon. Rain tapped softly against towering stained glass windows, while crystal chandeliers reflected muted light across polished marble floors. Every chair was occupied by members of Vincent Moretti's family, each dressed in expensive black clothing, each wearing the same expression of quiet expectation. Some whispered about investments. Others glanced toward the priceless paintings lining the walls, already imagining which pieces would soon belong to them. At the front of the room stood an elderly attorney named Charles Whitman, holding a thick leather folder that contained the final will of one of the most influential men in the state. His calm voice echoed through the silent hall as he adjusted his reading glasses. "Thank you all for coming. Mr. Vincent Moretti personally instructed that every beneficiary be present before this document could be opened." Across the room, standing near the back wall with folded hands, was Amara Brooks. She wore a simple black dress borrowed from another house employee because she had never expected to attend such an occasion. For nearly 8 years, she had worked quietly inside this mansion as a housekeeper, never asking for attention, never imagining she would become part of the day's conversation. She only came because Mr. Whitman had personally requested her presence. She hoped the reading would end quickly so she could quietly return to packing away the last of Vincent's personal belongings exactly as he had once shown her. Charles slowly opened the folder. The room grew so silent that even the ticking of the antique grandfather clock sounded unusually loud. Mr. Vincent Moretti's final wishes begin with the following statement, the attorney said. "To my family, I leave my gratitude for the years we shared. To the woman who never asked me for anything except to take my medicine on time, I leave everything else." Confused glances spread across the room. Several relatives frowned, assuming another name would follow. Instead, Charles continued without hesitation. "I hereby leave the entirety of the Moretti estate, including the mansion, surrounding property, personal collections, investment holdings, charitable trusts under my direct ownership, and all remaining assets to Miss Amara Brooks." For one long heartbeat, nobody moved. Then disbelief exploded across the room without anyone raising a voice. Chairs shifted. Eyes widened. Several family members turned toward the quiet woman standing against the wall, as though she had somehow become a stranger inside the very house she had carefully cleaned every morning. One of Vincent's nephews let out a short, disbelieving laugh. His sister shook her head before whispering, "This has to be some kind of mistake." Another relative immediately stood. She was only the maid. The words hung heavily in the air. Amara lowered her eyes, not from guilt, but from the sudden weight of every stare fixed upon her. She had never seen the estate as something to possess. To her, it had always been the place where she worked, where fresh flowers were changed every Monday, where books were dusted every Friday, and where one lonely man had quietly thanked her for treating him like a human being instead of a legend. Charles Whitman raised one hand, asking for silence before removing a second sealed envelope from the leather folder. Across its front, written in Vincent Moretti's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 simple words that instantly stopped every whisper in the room. "Open this only if my family objects." Charles Whitman carefully placed the sealed envelope on the polished oak table without opening it. His eyes slowly traveled across the room before resting on the Moretti family. "Mr. Moretti anticipated strong emotions," he said calmly. "He instructed me to continue only after everyone had the opportunity to respond." The invitation was all they needed. Questions erupted from every direction. Vincent's oldest nephew insisted the will had to be the result of manipulation. A cousin argued that no rational man would leave generations of family wealth to an employee. Another relative demanded copies of every legal document connected to the estate. Their voices overlapped until the grand ballroom no longer resembled a place of mourning. It sounded like a boardroom where people feared losing an investment rather than a family grieving someone they claimed to love. Through it all, Amara remained exactly where she had been standing. She did not interrupt. She did not defend herself. She simply held her hands together while looking toward the rain falling beyond the stained glass windows. None of the accusations surprised her. What surprised her was that Vincent had somehow expected every one of them. Finally, Vincent's younger sister, Eleanor Moretti, stepped forward with controlled composure. Unlike the others, she did not raise her voice. "Miss Brooks," she said, maintaining polite manners that barely concealed disbelief. "Surely you understand this cannot be what Vincent truly wanted. You cared for the house. We appreciate your service. But this estate belongs to his family." Amara slowly lifted her eyes. "I never asked Mr. Moretti for anything," she answered softly. "I did not know what was written in his will until this moment." Her quiet honesty only deepened the room's frustration. One of the grandsons laughed bitterly. "Convenient answer." Another shook his head. "Nobody works as a maid for 8 years without expecting something." Amara absorbed every word without changing her expression. Years of quiet work had taught her that dignity often meant remaining calm while others misunderstood you. Charles Whitman waited patiently until silence gradually returned. "For the record," he said, "this will was drafted 6 months ago, witnessed according to state law, reviewed by 2 independent physicians who confirmed Mr. Moretti was of sound mind, and finalized without Miss Brooks being present at any meeting." The explanation settled over the room, but convinced almost no one. The family exchanged skeptical looks, searching for another explanation that better matched what they wanted to believe. Eleanor folded her arms, then opened the second envelope. Charles looked down at the handwritten instructions before carefully breaking the seal. Instead of another legal document, he unfolded a single handwritten letter. Vincent's familiar handwriting covered every page in neat blue ink. Charles began reading aloud. "If you are hearing these words, then my greatest concern has already come true. You are questioning the character of the one person who never questioned mine." The room fell noticeably quieter. "Before any of you decide who deserves my estate, I ask only one thing. Remember how often you visited me during my final years. Then remember how often Amara did. If your memory fails you, the truth will not." Charles stopped reading and looked toward the final page. Attached beneath Vincent's signature was another legal instruction written in bold letters. "Should this will be challenged in court, my attorney is authorized to present additional evidence explaining every decision I made." The ballroom became silent once again, but this time the silence felt different. It no longer belonged to shock alone. It carried the uncomfortable realization that Vincent had prepared for this exact moment long before anyone else had imagined it would arrive. Long before anyone questioned the will, the answer had already been quietly unfolding inside the walls of the Moretti estate. 8 years earlier, when Amara Brooks first arrived carrying one small suitcase and a folded recommendation letter, nobody noticed her except the head housekeeper, who handed her a simple list of daily responsibilities. Dust the library before sunrise. Prepare fresh flowers every Monday. Keep the dining room ready for unexpected guests. Never interrupt Mr. Vincent Moretti unless he requested your presence. The mansion overlooking the rocky Massachusetts coastline was magnificent, but it felt strangely empty despite its endless hallways, priceless artwork, and polished marble floors. Employees moved with careful precision, speaking only when necessary, while Vincent spent most of his days inside his private study overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. His relatives visited often enough for holiday photographs and business conversations, yet they rarely stayed for dinner. Once the meetings ended, luxury cars disappeared through the front gates, leaving the estate silent once again. Amara quickly learned that loneliness echoed more loudly inside large houses than small ones. She also noticed something nobody else seemed to notice. Every afternoon, a tray carrying a carefully prepared lunch waited outside Vincent's office for hours before returning to the kitchen almost untouched. Fresh coffee became cold. Soup remained full. Fruit dried beneath the afternoon sun filtering through tall windows. When Amara quietly asked another employee why nobody reminded him to eat, the answer came immediately. "Everyone has tried. He tells us to leave him alone." The following day, she prepared another tray exactly the same way, but before placing it outside the office door, she added a small handwritten note beside the napkin. It simply read, "Work can always wait 5 minutes. Your health cannot. Please enjoy your lunch while it is still warm." She expected nothing in return. Late that evening, as she finished arranging books inside the library, Vincent unexpectedly appeared in the doorway holding the folded note. He studied her for several quiet seconds before asking, "Was this yours?" Amara nodded honestly. "I apologize if I overstepped." Vincent looked back down at the note before placing it carefully inside his jacket pocket instead of throwing it away. The soup was excellent, he replied before quietly walking away. It was the first personal conversation they had ever shared. Weeks slowly became months, and although Vincent remained reserved, small changes began appearing throughout the estate. Empty lunch trays became clean plates. Coffee cups returned empty instead of full. Sometimes fresh flowers unexpectedly appeared inside the library because Vincent noticed Amara replacing old arrangements before anyone else arrived. She never asked why. She simply smiled and continued working. During one particularly cold December evening, a heavy snowstorm delayed everyone from leaving the mansion after work. Electricity flickered briefly before emergency generators restored the lights. Most employees gathered in the kitchen, worried about icy roads, but Amara quietly prepared hot chocolate for everyone before carrying one final mug toward Vincent's study. She gently knocked once. "Come in," his familiar voice answered. She placed the steaming mug on his desk without speaking. Vincent looked at it, then toward the snow falling beyond the tall windows. "You should go home before the roads become worse," he said. Amara smiled politely. "Home can wait another few minutes. Everyone downstairs wanted to make sure you had something warm." Vincent remained silent. Nobody had ever said everyone before. They usually spoke only for themselves. As Amara reached the doorway, Vincent quietly called her name. She turned. "Thank you," he said simply. There was no audience to witness those words, no family members nearby, and no legal documents waiting in the future. It was only one lonely man beginning to understand that genuine kindness asks for nothing while quietly changing everything. As the years passed, routines inside the Moretti estate changed so gradually that almost nobody noticed except the people who lived there every day. Vincent still conducted business from sunrise until late evening, but he no longer spent every meal alone behind closed doors. Some afternoons, he carried his lunch onto the glass terrace overlooking the Atlantic Ocean simply because Amara had once mentioned that food always tasted better with fresh air. He never admitted she had influenced the habit, yet every employee quietly recognized the difference. The mansion itself seemed less intimidating. Fresh flowers filled every hallway. Classical music drifted softly through the library on Sunday mornings. Even the kitchen staff laughed more often because Amara believed a peaceful home was built through countless small moments rather than one grand gesture. While warmth slowly returned to the estate, Vincent's family continued appearing only when financial matters required attention. Luxury vehicles arrived through the front gates, expensive gifts were exchanged, business contracts were discussed, and elegant dinners filled the formal dining room with polished conversation. Yet as soon as the meetings ended, everyone hurried away to their own lives. Few ever noticed that Vincent remained standing alone beside the fireplace long after the final car disappeared down the long private driveway. Amara never commented on those visits. Instead, she quietly restored the silence they left behind. She replaced empty crystal glasses, folded forgotten napkins, watered fresh orchids, and reopened the library windows so the scent of the ocean could once again fill the house. One autumn afternoon, several years after she first arrived, Vincent unexpectedly found Amara sitting alone in the library repairing the torn cover of an old children's novel with careful hands. He looked at the worn book with curiosity. "That copy should probably be replaced," he said. Amara smiled gently without stopping her work. Some things become more valuable because they have been cared for instead of replaced. Vincent remained unusually quiet. After a few moments he asked, "Who taught you that?" Amara looked toward the fading sunlight stretching across the wooden floor. "My grandmother. She always believed people deserve the same patience we give old books." The answer stayed with Vincent far longer than either of them realized. Months later, after routine medical examinations revealed that his health was becoming increasingly fragile, Vincent found himself thinking about those words almost every day. Doctors recommended reducing stress, slowing his schedule, and spending more time with family. The advice sounded simple, yet reality proved different. Business partners remained busy. Relatives continued visiting only occasionally. The only person whose daily routine never changed was Amara. Every morning she still greeted him with the same respectful smile. Every afternoon she quietly reminded him to take his medication without sounding demanding. Every evening She made certain a warm meal waited before another long night of paperwork could begin. She never asked about his finances, his investments, or his future plans. She only asked whether he had eaten, whether the flowers needed fresh water, and whether the sea breeze felt colder than usual. One evening, Vincent stood alone beside the library window watching waves crash gently against the rocky shoreline as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Amara entered carrying a tray with herbal tea before quietly setting it beside him. "Beautiful sunset," she said softly. Vincent nodded without taking his eyes off the ocean. "Do you know what I have spent most of my life protecting?" he asked. Amara considered the question before answering. "Perhaps you spent too many years protecting your success instead of your peace." Vincent slowly turned toward her, surprised not because she had challenged him, but because nobody had ever described his life so honestly without asking for anything in return. In that quiet moment, surrounded by books, fading sunlight, and the sound of distant waves, Vincent made a decision that would one day leave an entire room speechless, although not even Amara realized that her simple words had already begun shaping his final wish. Several weeks after that conversation beside the library window, Vincent quietly asked Charles Whitman to visit the estate without informing anyone in his family. The meeting took place on a calm spring afternoon inside the same private study where countless business agreements had been signed over the years. This time there were no executives, no financial advisors, and no relatives waiting outside the door. Only Vincent, Charles, and a stack of legal documents rested upon the polished mahogany desk overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Sunlight reflected across the water while seabirds drifted peacefully above the waves, creating a silence that somehow made every word feel even more important. Charles carefully reviewed the papers before looking toward his longtime client. "Are you absolutely certain?" he asked. Vincent answered without hesitation. "More certain than I have ever been about any business decision." Charles adjusted his glasses. "Your family will challenge this." Vincent smiled faintly, almost as though he had expected the observation long before hearing it aloud. "That is exactly why I called you instead of waiting." Together, they spent several hours reviewing every page, every clause, and every signature required under state law. Two independent physicians later confirmed that Vincent fully understood every decision he was making. Each document was completed with extraordinary care because Vincent wanted no uncertainty after he was gone. When everything had finally been signed, Charles reached for the folder, but Vincent gently stopped him. "There is one more thing." He opened a nearby drawer and removed a small envelope already sealed with dark blue wax. Across the front, he slowly wrote, "Open only if my family refuses to believe my final wish." Charles accepted the envelope without reading its contents. He simply nodded, understanding that some explanations belonged to the future instead of the present. Throughout that entire afternoon, Amara remained completely unaware of what had happened upstairs. She spent the day planting fresh lavender beside the garden walkway because Vincent had once mentioned that the scent reminded him of peaceful summers from childhood. Later, she prepared homemade vegetable soup after noticing he had eaten very little during breakfast. She never asked why a lawyer had visited. She assumed another business matter had required attention, just as it had many times before. That evening, Vincent joined her briefly in the garden while the last golden light settled across the ocean cliffs. He looked at the newly planted flowers before quietly saying, "One day this place may belong to someone who truly understands what home means." Amara smiled politely, believing he was speaking about one of his relatives. "I hope whoever that person is takes good care of it." Vincent studied her for several silent seconds before answering almost to himself. "I believe they already do." She laughed softly, thinking he was complimenting the gardening staff, and returned to watering the lavender without another thought. Vincent watched her from the stone pathway, realizing she had never once imagined herself deserving anything beyond honest work and a peaceful life. That quiet humility became the final confirmation he needed. Wealth had surrounded him for decades, yet he had rarely witnessed someone who could stand beside immense privilege without ever trying to claim it. As evening settled over the estate, Vincent returned to his study alone and opened a leather journal resting inside the top drawer of his desk. On a fresh page, he wrote a single sentence in careful handwriting before closing the cover once more. "If kindness ever becomes my greatest legacy, then I have finally lived well." Years later, Those words would become far more important than every dollar, every title, and every acre of land his family believed they had already inherited. The courtroom overlooked downtown Boston through tall windows that reflected a gray winter morning, and every seat in the public gallery had been filled long before the hearing officially began. Reporters quietly organized notebooks outside the courtroom doors, while attorneys reviewed thick folders stacked across polished wooden tables. News of Vincent Moretti's extraordinary will had spread quickly, and many people expected another dramatic battle over wealth and influence. Amara Brooks arrived alone wearing the same simple navy blue suit she had owned for several years. She carried no expensive handbag, no jewelry beyond a modest silver watch, and no expression of triumph. To her, this was never about winning. She still wished Vincent were alive, sitting beside the library window with a cup of herbal tea instead of becoming the subject of legal arguments. Across the aisle, members of the Moretti family occupied nearly an entire row beside their legal team. Their confidence had returned after weeks of preparation. They believed the court would surely restore the estate to Vincent's blood relatives once every question surrounding the will had been examined. Charles Whitman quietly greeted Amara before placing several carefully organized binders onto the counsel table. His calm demeanor never changed, even as whispered conversations filled the room around them. When the judge entered, everyone immediately stood before taking their seats once again. The proceedings began with respectful formality. The family's attorney rose first, explaining that while they respected Vincent's accomplishments, they questioned whether the final will truly reflected his independent wishes. He argued that leaving an entire estate to a longtime employee appeared inconsistent with ordinary expectations and deserved closer examination. Throughout the presentation, nobody accused Amara of wrongdoing directly, yet every carefully chosen sentence implied that such an extraordinary decision could only have resulted from improper influence. Amara remained completely still, listening without interruption. Charles eventually stood and approached the podium carrying only a single folder instead of the towering stacks surrounding the opposing counsel. "Your Honor," he began calmly, "this case is not about assumptions. It is about documented facts." One by one, he presented medical evaluations confirming Vincent's mental clarity, witness statements verifying every legal requirement had been followed, and notarized records establishing that Amara had never attended any meeting concerning the will. Each document quietly removed another layer of speculation. Even so, several members of the Moretti family continued shaking their heads in disbelief. Finally, Charles paused before removing one small envelope from his briefcase. Every eye inside the courtroom followed the movement. The familiar dark blue wax seal remained perfectly preserved. "This," Charles said softly, "is the sealed instruction Mr. Moretti personally entrusted to me on the day he signed his final will. He directed that it be presented only if his family challenged his decision." The courtroom grew remarkably silent. Even the faint sound of traffic beyond the courthouse windows seemed to disappear. Charles carefully broke the seal and unfolded the handwritten pages. Before reading a single word, he looked toward the judge. "There is one additional item referenced within this letter," he explained. Mr. Moretti also left a private video statement recorded several weeks before his passing. Under his written instructions, that recording may now be presented to the court. A court technician quietly rolled a large display screen toward the center of the room, while every person inside watched without speaking. Amara lowered her eyes for a brief moment, suddenly realizing she was about to hear Vincent's voice again after many months of silence, and nothing in the courtroom felt more powerful than the quiet anticipation that settled over every heart before the screen slowly illuminated. The large display screen flickered softly before revealing Vincent Moretti seated inside his private library, the familiar Atlantic Ocean visible through the tall windows behind him. He wore a simple navy sweater instead of one of his usual tailored suits, and for the first time many people in the courtroom saw not the powerful businessman they had always known, but an aging man whose calm eyes carried unusual peace. He looked directly into the camera before speaking in a steady voice. "If this recording is being played, then my family has chosen to question the one decision I hoped would never require defending." The courtroom became completely silent. Even the attorneys stopped taking notes. Vincent continued, Before anyone judges Amara Brooks, I ask you to remember one simple truth. She never asked me for this house. She never asked me for my investments. She never asked me for my land. In fact, I am certain she will be more surprised than anyone listening today. A faint smile crossed his face. There is something none of you understand because very few of you were here often enough to witness it. The recording shifted briefly to several short home video clips that Vincent had instructed Charles to preserve. The first showed Amara quietly arranging fresh flowers throughout the mansion while humming softly to herself early one Monday morning. The second captured her replacing untouched lunches with fresh meals after long business meetings. Another clip showed her reading classic children's books to the grandchildren of several longtime estate employees during a holiday gathering, while Vincent watched quietly from across the library. None of the scenes appeared staged. They reflected ordinary moments that most people would never have considered important enough to record. Vincent's voice returned over the final images. Many people respected my position. Amara respected my humanity. Several members of the Moretti family lowered their eyes. Vincent continued speaking. When my doctors advised me to slow down, everyone suggested hiring additional nurses, assistants, or consultants. Amara never suggested any of those things. She simply reminded me to eat lunch while it was still warm, to step outside when the sunset was beautiful, and to call old friends before another year passed. She treated me like a person instead of a responsibility. He paused briefly before looking directly into the camera once more. If any member of my family believes this decision was made because I was lonely, then they are correct. But loneliness is not weakness. It is clarity. It teaches you exactly who remains beside you after every business meeting ends and every celebration becomes quiet. His expression softened. Amara never stayed because of what I owned. She stayed because she believed every human being deserved kindness, including one stubborn old man who often forgot to take care of himself. A gentle laugh escaped him before fading into thoughtful silence. Everything I built came from discipline and determination, but everything worth leaving behind came from the compassion I learned during my final years. That is why this estate belongs to her. Not as a reward, but as a responsibility. I trust her to protect this home better than anyone carrying my last name. The recording slowly came to an end with Vincent offering one final sentence. If you truly wish to honor my memory, stop asking who deserved my fortune and start asking why the only person who never wanted it became the one I trusted most. The screen faded to black, leaving nothing but the quiet sound of the courtroom ventilation as every person remained motionless, suddenly realizing that Vincent had already answered every question long before the trial had ever begun. For several long moments after the screen went dark, nobody inside the courtroom spoke. The silence carried far more weight than the arguments that had filled the room only an hour earlier. The judge quietly removed his reading glasses while several reporters lowered their pens, realizing that no headline could fully capture what everyone had just witnessed. Across the courtroom, members of the Moretti family avoided looking at one another. The confidence they had carried into the hearing slowly dissolved beneath the undeniable sincerity of Vincent's own words. Charles Whitman calmly returned the video recording to his briefcase before addressing the court once more. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "Mr. Moretti anticipated every legal concern raised today. He answered each one personally, voluntarily, and with full legal capacity. We ask only that his final wishes be honored exactly as written." The judge carefully reviewed the remaining documents before speaking in a measured voice. After examining the evidence presented, including the executed will, medical evaluations, witness testimony, and the recorded statement of Mr. Moretti, this court finds no legal basis to invalidate his estate plan. The will shall remain fully enforceable. The words echoed softly across the courtroom. There was no applause. No celebration, only quiet acceptance that the matter had reached its lawful conclusion. Amara slowly closed her eyes for a brief moment, not because she felt victorious, but because hearing Vincent's voice one final time had reminded her of every ordinary afternoon they had quietly shared inside the mansion overlooking the ocean. When the hearing officially ended, attorneys began collecting their files while reporters hurried outside, hoping to speak with the woman who had unexpectedly inherited one of the state's most remarkable estates. Amara stepped into the courthouse hallway where dozens of cameras immediately turned toward her. Questions arrived almost instantly. Will you move into the mansion? What do you plan to do with the fortune? Do you have a message for the Moretti family? She paused before the microphones with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the entire trial. Mr. Moretti trusted me with something much greater than property, she answered gently. He trusted me to protect the values he discovered during the final years of his life. I intend to honor that trust. She thanked the reporters for their time and quietly walked away before anyone could ask another question. Several days later, Amara returned alone to the Moretti estate for the first time since the court ruling. The mansion remained exactly as Vincent had left it. Morning sunlight poured through the library windows, fresh ocean air drifted across the polished wooden floors, and the familiar scent of lavender still lingered near the garden entrance. She slowly walked through each room without touching anything, remembering the countless ordinary moments that had quietly shaped both of their lives. Finally, she entered Vincent's private study. Resting neatly at the center of his mahogany desk was the leather journal he had written in shortly before changing his will. Charles had preserved it exactly as instructed. Amara carefully opened the final completed page and found the familiar sentence written in Vincent's steady handwriting. If kindness ever becomes my greatest legacy, then I have finally lived well. She gently closed the journal and looked toward the Atlantic Ocean beyond the tall windows. Tears filled her eyes, but they were not tears of grief alone. They carried gratitude for having known a man who had learned, even late in life, that true wealth was never measured by what people accumulated, but by what they entrusted to those whose character had already proven priceless. In that quiet room overlooking the endless sea, Amara made a promise that no court could ever require and no legal document could ever enforce. A promise that would soon transform Vincent's final gift into something even greater than anyone had imagined. Within 6 months, the Moretti estate no longer resembled the isolated mansion people had once associated with wealth and distance. Every decision Amara made reflected the promise she had whispered inside Vincent's study on that quiet afternoon overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The grand ballroom where business negotiations had once echoed with ambition became a community learning center where local students gathered after school for tutoring, music lessons, and college preparation programs. The enormous library Vincent had loved so deeply opened its doors every Saturday to neighborhood children who had never before stepped inside such a remarkable collection of books. The gardens surrounding the estate, once admired only by invited guests, welcomed families, veterans, teachers, and senior citizens seeking peaceful afternoons beside the ocean. Nothing about the mansion felt smaller after being shared. Somehow, it felt larger than ever. Amara refused to remove Vincent's favorite chair from the library window overlooking the sea. Fresh flowers still appeared beside it every Monday morning, just as they had for years. A warm cup of herbal tea rested on the small table each Friday afternoon, quietly honoring the simple routine they had once shared. Visitors occasionally asked why the untouched chair remained exactly as it had been. Amara always answered with the same gentle smile. Some places remind us that gratitude deserves a permanent seat. News of the transformation spread far beyond Massachusetts. Journalists who had once expected stories about luxury renovations instead found classrooms filled with children, scholarships carrying Vincent's name, and community programs funded by the very fortunes so many people had fought to possess. Even several members of the Moretti family quietly returned months later, not to reclaim property, but to witness what the estate had become. Eleanor Moretti stood silently inside the restored library one autumn afternoon while children laughed over storybooks at long wooden tables. She watched Amara patiently helping a young girl choose her first novel before finally walking over. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Then Eleanor lowered her eyes and said softly, "I spent so much time believing Vincent had abandoned his family that I never realized he was trying to teach us what family was supposed to look like." Amara answered with kindness instead of triumph. He never wanted anyone to lose. He only wanted something good to continue after he was gone. Eleanor nodded slowly before offering to volunteer at the Learning Center once each week. It was a small beginning, but it was real. As another year passed, the estate flourished into exactly the place Vincent had quietly imagined during his final days. Thousands of books found new readers. Hundreds of students received scholarships. Countless visitors discovered peace walking through gardens once hidden behind iron gates. Yet the greatest change could never be measured by numbers. It lived inside ordinary moments when strangers greeted one another with warmth, when children believed impossible dreams might actually come true, and when kindness quietly replaced suspicion. One evening, as the sun settled beyond the Atlantic Ocean in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Amara stood beside the library window, holding Vincent's leather journal. She gently opened to the final page before smiling at the familiar sentence one last time. Then she carefully placed the journal back onto the shelf where future generations could read the story of a man who discovered, almost too late, that the richest inheritance was never money at all. It was the courage to recognize goodness before the rest of the world did. Outside, waves continued meeting the rocky shoreline with the same quiet rhythm they had carried for generations, while inside the old mansion, laughter drifted through halls once defined by silence. And on that peaceful evening, everyone who entered those doors unknowingly became part of the legacy that Vincent Moretti had truly intended to leave behind, proving that dignity, gratitude, and compassion will always outlive fortune.